In this demonstration, we're going to take a simple set of vectors and using a variety of modelling tools, we're going to look at modelling the sign that you can see here. We'll be looking at how we can create geometric shapes, how we can create organic shapes, how we can model text, and how we can use image data to create components from. Once we've got the panel that you can see here, we'll then show you how you can easily create the toolpath in order for you to cut that out on the CNC machine. I'm just going to close this down, and then we're going to open an existing file. I'm going to open the MagicBean vector file, and here we have a set of vectors that were drawn in the software using the drawing tools, and there is a tutorial that covers this vector creation with the software. When I start creating shapes from these vectors, I'd like to be able to see the shapes that we're creating. So to help me, I'm going to come into the 2D view control. We're going to use this option here to tile the windows. That way I can see the 2D view on the left, and I can also see the 3D view on the right hand side. What I'd like to do is just alter the appearance of my 3D view. So I'm going to come over to the job setup, and then we're just going to come down to the bottom and alter the appearance. Currently it's set to a solid colour. What I'd like to do is change that and make that a cherry. So you can see now that's been updated there. Whilst I'm here, I'm just going to up the resolution and make that high so that we have more pixels to play with. Then I'm going to go and press OK. So now we're ready to take these vectors and start creating components from them. To do that, we need to come into the Modelling tab, and this is where we can access all of the tools in order for us to create and edit components. The way we're going to model this is from the bottom up, so we're going to look at creating all of the base shapes first. So to help me keep my componentry organised in advance, I'm going to rename level 1 by right mouse clicking. Using the option here to rename level, we're going to call this level base. Any component that I create now will be added to this base level. So the first shape I'd like to create is going to form the main panel for our sign. So I'm going to take this vector here, I'm going to hold down Shift and select this vector here, and we're going to use a modelling function called the 2-rail sweep. What that allows me to do is create a shape that's defined by its 2 vector rails and a cross section or a series of cross sections that will be swept in between the 2 vector rails. So with those vectors selected, let's go over into the Modelling Tools section. We're going to use this second icon here for the 2-rail sweep. That's going to open up the 2-rail sweep form. Now we already have our vectors selected, so we're going to use this option here to use selection, and that will transform those vectors into drive rails. So all we need to do now is choose a cross section that we'd like to sweep between these 2 vector rails, and it's this cross section here. And then we're going to apply that cross section and put that in the rails. I'm going to right mouse click, use the option here to add to all rail nodes. That way we're going to get nice sharp corners. Then if I go ahead now and just press apply just so we can see how that looks. Okay, so I'm happy with the outside of that. I'd like to fill the centre here, so I'm going to use this option here to fill centre of inner closed vector rails. We'll give that component a name, so we're going to call that base. I'm going to press apply. We can see that that's instantly updated there in the 3D view, and we have our first 3D object. So we've got our base there. So now we can just close that form down. We'll just put that in isometric view. The next shape I'd like to create will be a recessed shape between this vector here. If I hold down Shift and select this vector here, in order for me to do this, with those vectors selected, I'm going to come over to the first icon within the Modelling Tools. We're going to select the Create Shape from Vectors option. In here, I can assign a shaped profile and an angle in order for me to create a shape between a closed vector or a series of closed vectors. In this case we've got 2, so we're going to create a shape that's going to go from this outer vector to the inner vector that we've got selected there. In this case I'd like to have an angular profile, so I'm going to select that option there. For the angle I'm going to put in a value of 60 degrees. In this case, I'd like to limit the height of this, so we're just going to limit it to a specified value that I'm going to put in here, and I'd like to limit the height of that to be 1/2 inch. I could go ahead and give that a name, so we're just going to call that recess. I could press apply. We can see how that looks. Okay, so that's the correct shape, however it's adding on top of my panel, and I want this to subtract into the panel. Put that back in isometric view, and if we come over to the combine with other components section here, we can see it's set to add. What I'd like to do is set that to subtract. We can see that's now been updated, and I have the shape looking the way I want it to. So here I could just go ahead now, just press apply to apply those changes, and I'm going to come down here and start a new component and create a new shape. And I'm going to use this vector here, and what I'd like to do is create a dished shape. So with that vector selected, this time I'd like to use a curved profile, so I'd like more of a dish shape in here, so we're going to go with that curved profile. For the angle, I'm just going to type in a value of 45 degrees in this case. Again, we're going to look at limiting the height of that. I'm going to make that 1/2 inch. Again, we're going to set that to subtract, as we want that to be a dish shape within the panel that we already have there. We could give that a name, so I'm just going to call that dish. We could press apply, and we can instantly see those changes have been updated there in the 3D view. And so I'm happy with that. Let's put that back in isometric view, and then we could close the create shape form down. So now we have all the shapes that form the base shapes of my model. So at this stage I could go ahead now and just minimize that level, and we could start to think about the next set of components that we're going to create. In this case, what I would like to do is create a textured background that's going to sit within that recess area. And in Aspire we have the ability to create a component from a bitmap. So before we go ahead and look at that, let's just go and insert a new level. So we're working with a new area within our design. So it's just to help me keep my componentry organized. I'm going to right mouse click on the base level. We're going to use this option here to insert a new level. I'm going to right mouse click on level 1, and we're going to rename that level. I'm going to call this level texture. We can see that is bold, so anything that I create now is going to be added into that texture level. So in order for us to create a component from a bitmap, we need to come up to this icon over here to create a component from a selected bitmap. So in the project folder, I'm just going to open the Coffee Beans JPEG file and press open. So to help us see this a little bit better, I'm just going to uncheck the base level just for the time being, so we're just concentrating on this texture that we've got there. Now if that's selected, if we just alter the size of that just so you can see that a little bit better. So with that selected, let's go over to set selected object size. I'm going to change the height of that. We'll make sure link XY is checked, and we're going to make the height of that 21 inches and press apply. Then we can close that down. Now if we take a look in the 3D view, you can see that the software has created the component based on the bitmap, and so the software has automatically generated this component based on the light and dark areas in the image, where the light areas are high in our 3D model and the dark areas are represented by the lower areas within that model. So with that component selected, let's just go and align that to our circle. So I'm going to hold down Shift, select that circle there. I'm going to come over here to align selected objects and align that to the center of the last item in this selection, which was that circle vector. So let's just close that down. If we take a look at the component in the 3D view, we can see there's quite a lot of noise there. What I'd like to do is just look at reducing that, and we could do that by applying a smooth filter. So we're going to go into this icon here, and it's going to do that at a default of 50%. We can see straight away it's reduced quite a bit of the noise there. If I wanted to, I could just maximize that just to really soften that up. And I'm happy with that, so then we could go ahead now and just press OK. What I'd like to do next is look at cropping our texture component to the vectors that we used to create our recessed shape. So it's these two vectors here. So what I need to do is select my component first, then I'm going to hold down Shift and carefully select the outer circle vector. Still holding down Shift, I'm going to select that inner one, and then we're going to come over here and use this option to clear area of selected component outside selected vectors. What that essentially does is remove everything outside of the vectors that we've got selected, so it works like a cookie cutter. So let's just switch on the base level just to see how that looks in the 3D view when they're all combined together. So first off, I can see that we have quite a lot of height within our texture component. I only really want to hint at that texture, so I'm going to look at reducing that. So to do that, I'm going to select the component there. We're going to go into the properties form, and I'm just going to alter the shape height of that and make that 0.2, press space to enter that in. We can see that's been updated there in the 3D view. If we close that down, we can see that I'm also getting some strange results as to how this coffee bean texture is being combined with the overall composite model. If we take a look at the level, we can see that the texture level is adding on top of the base level. What I'd like for this component to do is blend in with the rest of the model. So I'm going to take the texture level, I'm going to right mouse click, we're going to go into the combine mode, set that to merge. We can see now that is blending in with the current composite model. And so I'm happy with the way that that looks. So I'm going to put that back in isometric view, and then we could go and minimize that texture level. And now I'd like to look at the next element of my design, which is going to be this leaf area here. So again, I'm going to go and insert a new level. So I'm going to right mouse click, use the option here to insert a new level, right mouse click, I'm going to rename that level. I'm going to call that level Leaves. I'm just going to switch off the texture level, switch off the base level. I'm just going to focus on this leaves level here. So I'm just going to box select the leaves there, and then we're going to use this option here to zoom selected. And the first component I'm going to create is a dome for this circle area here. So we're looking at creating a berry shape. So with that vector selected, we're going to come over into the modelling tools and use the option here to create shape from vectors. In this case, I'd like to create a domed shape, so I'm going to go with a curved profile here, and I'm just going to maximise that, make that up to 90 degrees. If we move down the form, I don't want to add a base height in this instance, but what I would like to do is scale this to an exact height. So I'm going to use this option here to scale to an exact height, and I'm going to make the exact height here of 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to set that to merge. I'm going to call this one Dome, and then go ahead now, press apply. We can see that's been updated there in the 3D view. So I'm happy with that shape. Put that back in isometric view, and then we can close that form down. The next shape we're going to create is going to form this leaf here. So I'm going to take this vector here, to hold down Shift and select this vector here. We're going to use a function within the software called the 2-rail sweep. This allows us to create a shape that's defined by its vector rails and a cross section. So I'm going to go in there, select the 2-rail sweep option. As we have our vectors already selected, I'm going to use this option here to use selection. If I just zoom out of the 2D view for the time being, what I'd like to do is just ensure that these rails are pointing in the same direction. So I'm just going to right mouse click, use the option here to reverse rail. So now I can see that my rails are both in the same direction, in which I could go ahead, select a cross section. So this is the profile that I'd like to sweep between these two vectors, and then we could go ahead and press apply. If I just zoom in on the 3D view so we can take a look at that, you can see it's not too bad. What I would like to do in order for me to create more of a natural looking shape is use this option here to scale cross sections with width. So that's going to scale the cross section against the width of the two vectors, so where the two vectors come close together the shape height will be lower, and where vectors are further apart the shape will have a bit more height in. We're going to call this leaf. I'm also going to scale this to an exact height, so the exact height of this, or the highest point of this, is going to be exactly a value that I put in here, which is going to be 1/4 of an inch. And so if I go ahead now and press apply, we can see how that's turned out. So you can see it's lower at the end where the vectors come close together, and then we have a bit more height here in the centre and the highest point of that is going to be 1/4 of an inch. You can see that I'm getting a funny interaction here. So in the combine with other components section, I'm going to change that and make that merge, so it's merging in with the previous component, and we can see how that looks. So I'm happy with that, so I'll just apply that, and then I'm going to close that form down. Put that back in isometric view over there. And then what I'm going to do now is take that leaf, and I'd like to create a mirrored copy of that below this line here. So if that's selected, I'm going to hold down Shift and select this vector here. I'm going to come into Transform Objects and use the option to mirror selected objects, and just use this option here to flip about line. We can see it's created that mirrored copy, flipping that over the line that we had selected. So I can close that down. What I'd like to do is group these 3 components. So I'm just going to, with the leaf selected, hold down Shift, select the dome, right mouse click, use this option here to group them. So now the software just sees that as one component. If I wanted to ungroup them at any point, I could do so by just right mouse clicking and using the option to ungroup it, so I could go back to all of those individual parts that make up this entire leaf group. What I should do is just rename that group, so I'm just going to rename that, and we're just going to call that leaf group, just to keep that organised. And so let's go and switch on the texture level and switch on the base level, and just see how everything's interacting with each other. So again, like the texture level, we can see that that texture is being transmitted through to that leaf, and that's because our leaves level is currently adding on top of that texture level. So what I need to do is set the leaves level to merge with everything else. So with the leaves selected, I'm going to right mouse click, go to the combine mode, we're going to set that to merge. So now we can see in the 3D view that it's now blending in with that texture. However, we can see that our leaves are being partially obscured by the texture. So what I need to do is just alter the properties of this leaf group. So with that selected, let's go into the properties form. What I'd like to do here is just add in a very small base height of 0.2. We'll press space to enter that in. We can see now that's lifted that up, and it's now stood proud and prominent of that texture. So I can close that down. I'm going to put that back in isometric view, and I'm also just going to use the option here to zoom to fit, just so we can see the entire part. So what I'd like to do now is create a mirrored copy of our leaf group to go on the right hand side over here. So with that component group selected, I'm going to go into Transform Objects, Mirror Selected Objects, Flip Job About Center, Create a Mirrored Copy is checked, and then we're going to flip that horizontal. We can close that down. We can see we have our second leaf group on the right hand side now. So let's just minimize that level, and then we're going to go and insert a new level, as we're now ready to create the next part of our model, which is the coffee beans here. So I'm going to right mouse click, use the option here to insert a new level, right mouse click again, we're going to rename that level, we're going to call this level coffee beans. I'm just going to type that in, and then any components that I create now will be added to this level. Again, like we've done in the past, let's just switch off the other levels, so we've just got our focus on the one level. I'm going to select this vector here. I'm going to use this option here to zoom selected, so we can see those vectors a little bit better in our 2D view. We're going to start by creating the back bean. So I'm going to take this vector here, and we're going to use the Create Shape from Vectors option to create the shapes for our coffee beans. So I'm going to go in there, and then we need to assign a profile. So I'm going to go with a curved profile. I'm going to make the angle of that 90 degrees. Here I'm going to scale this to an exact height. So I'm going to put that to 0.2. And if we just press apply just to see how that looks, I'll just zoom in on the 3D view. It's not too bad. What I'd like to do is have an edge at the top of the bean there. So in order for me to do that, I'm going to apply a tilt. So I'm going to use a tilt option here. I'm going to set my anchor, so I'm going to make it tilt from the bottom here to the top. So I'm just clicking there. You can see that that's lifted up that top area and it's put a wedge on that model. Now 10 degrees is a bit too much, so I'm just going to reduce that down, see what 2 degrees looks like. You can see we just have a small edge on the top there. So I'm happy with that. We'll just put that in the Z view, and then we could call that one back bean, and then press apply, and then we could go and start a new component. So then I'm going to select this vector here, and again we're going to go the curved profile 90 degrees. This time I'm just going to up the scale to exact height here, make that 1/4 of an inch, and then press apply. Okay, if we just zoom in there, okay, if we just set that to merge, you can see how that looks. You can see that it's blending into the back bean, so I could do with applying a tilt on this bean also, just to lift the top area of that front bean so it's sat proud in front of the back bean. So I'm going to use the tilt option here. We're going to set the anchor. I'm going to go from the bottom here in the direction here. So I'm just going to click again, and then I'm just going to use the slider just to set the right amount of tilt, and you can see that I'm getting those instant results there in the 3D view, and so I'm happy with that. So I'll call that one front bean. Then I could press apply, and I'm going to go and start a new component. And then I'm going to select this vector here that represents this creased area of the bean. This time I'm going to go with an angled profile here, and I'm just going to put in a value 35 degrees. I'm going to set that to no limit, and I'd like that to subtract into the bean that we just created. We're going to call this one crease. And then we could go now and press apply. We can see that's been updated there in the 3D view. And we've created all the shapes that form those coffee beans. So I can close this form down. We'll just put that back in the Z view there. And then I'm going to go and group all of those components together so the software sees it as one entity. I'm going to take the crease, hold down Shift, select the back bean, right mouse click, use this option here to group. Right mouse click again, let's just rename that and we'll just call that beans. And then I just want to do a final check and just check the height of the overall group. So with that selected, let's go over to the properties form. We can see the current height here is 0.42. We know that the dish that these beans are sat within is at a depth of 1/2 inch, so we have 1/2 inch to play with. So I'm just going to look at rounding this up a little bit to 0.45, press space to enter that in. We can close that down. So now we can switch on the other levels and just see how our part looks so far. So I'm satisfied with the overall look of the model that we've got there. So I'm just going to minimize the coffee beans level. And then in the 2D view, I'm going to use this option here to zoom to fit so we can see the entire job there. And now we're ready to create the last set of components that will form the fresh coffee text. So again, like we've done before, let's go and insert a new level by right mouse clicking, use the option here to insert a new level, right mouse click again, we're going to rename that level, we're going to call this level text, and then I'm going to select the fresh, and then I'm going to hold down Shift and select the text coffee. Then I'm going to come up here and create shape from vectors. In this case, I'd like to give that an angular profile. I'm just going to up the angle. We're going to make that 75 degrees. And I'm going to limit the height of that. So we're going to limit that to a height of 0.4. I'm going to call this text. We'll press apply, and then we can close that down. And if we look in the 3D view, we can see that that texture is being transmitted through the text there, and that's because the text level is currently set to add, so it's adding on top of those levels that are below it. So what we need to do is change the combine mode of the level to merge, so it's going to blend in with the components below. So let's just right mouse click here, go to the combine mode, we're going to set that to merge, and so now we can see that that texture is not being transmitted through that text there. If I just maximize the 3D view, and then if we just zoom in just to take a better look at the text there, See, it's not too bad. What I might do is just apply a small smooth filter over the fresh coffee text. So I'm going to select the text, and then I'm going to go and apply a smoothing filter. So we can see at the default of 50%, that's a little too strong, so I'm just going to reduce that down to between 25–30%. You can see now we've got nice smooth over. So I'm happy with that, so we'll just OK that, and then let's just put that in the Z view there. So now we're almost ready to calculate the toolpaths. So before I do that, I'm just going to minimize this level here. I'm going to go and tile our windows. What I need to do is take this vector that represents the outer area of my panel, and what I'd like to do is offset that outwards so that we create a vector that we can use as part of our toolpath boundary selection. So if that's selected, let's go into the drawing tab. I'm going to use this option here to offset selected vectors. I'm going to offset that outwards by 0.15. And so this will ensure that the tool has enough room to fit down the side of our border when we do our roughing and finishing toolpath. I'm going to offset that, and we can see it's offset that vector that we originally had selected. So let's just close that down. Now, to make the vector selection easier, I'm just going to go and select all of those vectors that represent the areas that I'd like to use on the 3D roughing and the 3D finishing toolpaths. So if that vector is selected, let's just hold down Shift and select this vector here. Still holding down Shift, I'm going to select these 3 circle vectors there also. I'm going to come over here to Edit Objects. I'm going to use this option here to group selected objects. And so now that they're grouped, they represent the boundaries from a 3D roughing and the 3D finishing toolpaths, and by grouping them it just means that I can click on any of them in order to select them all. So now we're ready to go over to the Toolpaths tab, so I could use this option here to switch over to the Toolpaths tab. And the first thing that we need to do is set up our material, so we're going to go and set that up. So this is where we relate the software to the actual physical setup on our machine. So start by looking at the material. So in this case I'm going to set Z0 off the top of the block. The material thickness that we're working with is 1 inch. My XY position is currently in the centre. I'd like that to be in the lower left hand corner in this case. Then we move down to the model positioning material. So this is where we can choose where we want our model positioned within our material block. Now I'd like that pushed right to the top so that the face of our model is at Z0. So I'm going to leave that at 0 gap above the model there. Then we check our rapids and home positions and ensure that they're safe for our particular setup. Once we're happy with that, we can then go ahead and just press OK. So the first toolpath we're going to create using the vectors that we've got selected here is the 3D roughing toolpath. So let's just go in there, and this toolpath is designed to hog away the majority of the material to make it safe for us to come in afterwards using a smaller tool to get in at the detail for our finishing toolpath. So the first thing that we need to do is select a tool. We can see the current tool is a 1/4 inch end mill, and this is the tool that I'd actually like to use. Now if I go into the edit option here, we can see the parameters and settings for this tool. If I wanted to make changes, I can do here, and that will apply those to this toolpath only. So I'm just going to go and press OK here. The machine and limit boundary, we're going to use the selected vectors, those vectors that we've already got selected. The offset, I do not want an offset in this case as we've already offset that outer vector, so I don't need to include a boundary offset in this case here. We then move on to the machine allowance. So this is a skinner material that we're going to leave on the material to reduce the chance of the roughing toolpath chipping at the material, and also make sure that we leave some material for the finishing toolpath to cut out. I'm just going to put in a value of 0.03 in this case. Then we can choose our roughing strategy, so we could choose a Z-level strategy or a 3D raster strategy. In this case I'm just going to go with a Z-level strategy, and then here I could give that a name, so I'm just going to call that 3D roughing, and then we could go ahead now and press calculate. And as soon as the software's calculated that, we can see that it's displaying that toolpath here in the 3D view, and it's automatically opened the preview toolpaths form. And this preview function in the software is an extremely powerful feature, as it allows us to animate exactly what the toolpath is going to do in a virtual piece of material. And so we get a good 3D representation of what the part should look like after we actually cut this out on the CNC. So to see that preview, we just press this button here, Preview Selected Toolpath. The software will take a moment to simulate the cut in our virtual piece of wood. So let's just maximise the 3D view, and then we'll just zoom in to take a look at that preview. And we can see how this part is going to be cut away using those parameters that we entered. And so if you're happy with that preview, you could go ahead and press close. If you wasn't, you could go back into that toolpath, alter with the settings until you're happy with the preview that you get here in the 3D view. So I'm happy with that, so I'm just going to go and press close. I'm going to go to view, I'm just going to tile my windows vertical and put that back in the Z view over there. So now we can go and run our 3D finishing toolpath. So we've got our vectors selected. Let's come over, run the 3D finishing toolpath. Tool I'd like to use is an 1/8 inch ball nose. We can see that that is currently selected. So I'm just going to use the edit option here just to check some of the information regards this tool. Now when we are doing the finishing toolpath, the step over of the tool, or the distance between each pass that it's going to take as it steps across the part, is very important. And we need to make sure that this value is small enough that I get a nice, clean, smooth finish. Now 10% of the tool's diameter is typically a good value to use to get a reasonable cut. So I'm going to leave that 10% there. We could go now and press OK. Then we need to move on to the machine and limit boundary. In this case, we've got those vectors selected, so I'm going to use the selected vectors. Boundary offset, we want to make that to 0, as we already offset that outer vector before we came in and created our toolpaths. Then we move on to the area machine strategy. In this case, what I would like to do is use an offset strategy. So this will follow the shape of the vectors rather than using a raster strategy, which will just go back and forth in straight lines. So I'm going to use the offset option here. I'm going to go give that a name. I'm going to call this one 3D Finish. Press Calculate, and that's just going to take a moment for the software to calculate that toolpath and provide us with a preview. So you can see that preview there, and we can see that the software has automatically opened up the Preview Toolpaths form. So let's just preview that toolpath and see how that looks. So let's just maximise the 3D view. We'll put it in isometric view, just zoom in a little. We can see that it's picked up a lot of detail there, and I'm happy with the simulation that we've got here. So now I'm going to go close that form down, put that back in Z. I'm going to go to View, I'm going to tile the windows vertically, and now we can think about the next toolpath, which is the Magic Bean text. I'd like to V-carve this text, so if that's selected, let's go over to the V-carve toolpath option. I'm going to make the start depth 0, so that's at the top face of our panel here. And then I need to select a tool from the tool database. To do that, I'm just going to press select. That's going to open up that tool database, and in here I can choose a V-bit. In this case, I'd like to use the 120-degree V-bit. This is a special sign making tool. So I'm going to go and press OK here. Just going to go call that V-carve, and then we could go and calculate that. Let's just maximize the 3D view, put that in isometric view, and then let's just go ahead and preview that, and we can see it's going to create a toolpath based on the vectors and the angle and the size of the tool that we had selected. And so I'm happy with the results that we've got here. So I'm going to go and press close, put that back in the Z view, go to view. We're going to go and tile our windows vertically. So now we're ready to cut our model out of our material block. We're also going to look at cutting into these circle vectors that we've got here, and these represent our hanging holes to hang the sign. So I'm going to select this vector first, hold down Shift, we're going to select this one second. I'm just going to zoom in and carefully select our boundary vector. So with those vectors selected, let's come over to the toolpath operations, and we're going to use the profile toolpath for this. So we're going to make the start depth 0, the cut depth we're going to cut all the way through the material, so we're going to make that 1 inch. the tool that I'd like to use is a 1/4" end mill, and we can see that that is currently selected. So I could just use the edit option here just to review some of the parameters and feeds and speeds in here and alter those if I felt I needed to, or if I felt it was safe to do so. I'm happy with these, so I'm just going to press OK. And then we move on to the machine vectors. In this case, I'd like to machine outside. Now, as we have vectors within our outer vector, the software automatically knows to cut outside of the outermost vector, and any vectors that we've got selected within that vector, the software will automatically cut inside of those vectors. And then it would alternate that if it found additional vectors inside of these. So we're going to use the outside option here. And then we can move down and look at the tabs, where I could look at adding tabs to this toolpath if I wanted to hold the part in the material block. However, I'm going to assume that I have an appropriate hold down system in place. We could also look at adding leads or ramps to this toolpath to control the way that the tool plunges into the material. And so using leads can help you reduce potential marking on the edge of the part, and using ramps can help you reduce the potential stress on a tool as it plunges down into the job. For this, I'm cutting fairly soft material, so I don't need to worry about these options here. So I'm just going to come down, give that a name, we'll just call that profile, press calculate. Then if we just maximize the 3D view, and we can see that the software's showing us the lines of the toolpath, and then we could just go ahead now and just preview that toolpath. We can see what that part will look like. Now within the preview, we have the option to double click any waste material in order to delete them in the 3D view. So you just double click any waste material here. That way you can show our customer very clearly what the part is going to look like when it's been run, taking into account the size of the tool, the shape of the tool, and the parameters we've entered for the toolpaths. If we want, we could click on this button here to save a preview image and then email that over to the customer, or we could even use this as an image on our website or in promotional material. And so if you're happy with that, then we could look at now outputting the toolpaths and send them over to the CNC for us to cut that out. So let's just close that down. So to save a toolpath, we're just going to select them in the order that we want to output them. So I'm going to take the 3D roughing, I'm going to come over here to save toolpath. That's just going to open up the save toolpath form. We can see the toolpath to be saved is listed here. And then what we need to do is choose an appropriate post processor for my machine tool or the control software that I use on my particular CNC. In this case, I'm just going to go the standard G code. I only have to select this once and the software will always remember that, so I don't have to go through that list again. And then we use this option here to save the toolpath. Then we'd go and select our next toolpath and again save that and go through the list, so on. So let's just close that down. And then once you've saved all of those toolpaths onto your hard drive, you could then go ahead and transfer them onto a thumb drive or send them over to the network to the CNC itself so you can start to cut the part. So now that we've got our finished part, it's a good idea to save the file. You can do that by going to File, Save As, and give that an appropriate name in which you can then access that at a later date. And so that concludes this tutorial where we've seen how you can take a set of vectors and use a variety of modelling tools that we have in the software to create lots of different shapes, from geometric borders to organic leaves and beans. We looked at modelling text and even how we could create three-dimensional textures. Then once we created the model, we can use the toolpaths that we've got access to in the software and the vectors to calculate different styles of toolpaths depending on what we're trying to cut. Here we use 3D roughing and 3D finishing toolpaths for the 3D areas. We looked at V-carving for the other text. We also looked at how we can use the profile toolpath to cut the part out. Now this example is actually covered in a lot more detail in the tutorials themselves. And so that completes this demonstration. Thank you for watching.